The day I realized my son had blocked me on everything. I was sitting in my old Ford at the curb outside the rental complex near his campus in Columbus, one hand resting on the steering wheel, while the heater in the car hummed on like some aging animal still trying to do its duty one last time. Late November in Ohio has a very particular kind of cold. It is not brutal all at once, but it keeps slipping in through the smallest places, through the edge of the window, through the part of your sleeve you forgot to pull down all the way, through the gap between your collar and the skin of your neck, exactly like certain kinds of pain in a person's life that, at first, you keep telling your elf you can handle. I had driven up there early that morning, bringing a plastic bin with a few things Ethan had left behind over the summer, a gray hoodie with the logo of his old school on it, the odd wrench set he texted me about back in September. Just leave it there, I'll grab it later. And a paper bag with the chicken sandwich I bought at a rest stop off I-71 because I still remembered how, back in 12th grade, every time he was anxious about exams or something else he didn't want to put into words, he would eat too fast and then say he wasn't hungry, as if filling his mouth with something was the most legitimate way not to explain where his heart had gone hollow. I had texted him 3 times on the drive up, once when I left Dayton, once when I stopped for gas, once when I turned onto his street. None of them were read. At first, I still thought maybe he was in class, or his phone had died. Or maybe he was just angry about something and wanted to stretch it out a little longer because he was still the right age for that. I sat there another 20 minutes, watching students move up and down the sidewalk in thick coats, backpacks slung over one shoulder, hot coffee in their hands, watching one young couple argue in low voices and still walk together through the crosswalk, watching old snow turn gray around the roots of the tree. Then I called him. The call rang once and cut off. I tried again. This time it did not ring at all. I opened our messages and sent one more line. Dad's outside your place. Come get your stuff whenever. It never turned blue. I opened Facebook. I could not find his account. I tried Instagram, even though I had never liked using it much. Nothing. I opened my personal email and typed a sentence so foolish it embarrassed me. If you're mad, I understand. Just tell me you're okay. The email bounced back almost instantly with the kind of message that, at my age, I should have seen as cold and meaningless as every other technical error line. But in that moment, it went through my chest like something with a sharp edge. Recipient has blocked sender. I stared at the screen until the words started to blur. Then I opened our old text thread and scrolled up to the last message from almost 3 weeks earlier, the one I sent after an unanswered call. Call me when you're ready. It had never been read. It sat there like a door I thought I had left cracked open, only to find out it had been locked from the other side a long time ago, and I had never known. I stayed there for a few more minutes, both hands on the steering wheel, not crying, not hitting anything, not doing any of the things that make a man look like someone who has just been erased from his own son's life in both the technical and the true sense. I just sat there and kept thinking the same sentence over and over. The sentence men my age almost never let themselves say honestly, because it means admitting they are no longer in control of the story of their own life, the way they thought they were. What did I do? If I were telling this story to a stranger in the shortest possible version, I guess I would say my son and I used to be close. Then after the divorce, he slowly drifted away. Then there was one major misunderstanding. Then years passed in silence, and finally I found out the truth. But that is the kind of version people tell, only when they still believe family life moves in a few clear turning points, like an evening television drama. The truth is not like that. The truth is that what makes a child drift away from his father almost never begins with one explosion. It begins with the things that are not said when they should be, with the times we think what we do is enough to stand in for what we never say, with the kind of exhaustion that makes adults believe that keeping the house standing is already a complete form of love, with a man like me who grew up in suburban Ohio with a father who never once said, "I love you," but would change the oil in your car at 6 in the morning when it was 10 below outside, would stand in the rain to watch you throw a ball, would fix every broken thing in the house as if that were the only decent language he had ever and permission to speak. I was that kind of man. For so long, I stopped seeing the price of it. Ethan used to understand that language of mine, at least when he was small. He was the kind of kid who would run into the garage and sit on an old plastic chair just to watch me fix anything, from a rattling door handle to the chain on his bike after it slipped when he tried to race down the hill at the end of our street, faster than the other kids. He would ask those loose, half-shaped questions while I tightened bolts or wiped my hands on a rag. Do you think dogs dream? If I keep missing shots, do you think the team will stop letting me play? Do you ever get scared when you have to talk in front of a lot of people? I remember once he was 8, sitting on the garage step with both knees scraped from falling off his bike, asking in a small voice if grown-ups always knew what they were doing. I laughed, straightened his bent brake handle, and told him no one ever really knows completely. You just keep doing the next thing. At the time, I thought I was giving him a good lesson. I did not know that later, in so many moments when Ethan truly did not know what to do with his fear, or with the chaos inside him. That answer of mine would come back to him not as calm, but as proof that his father always tried to fix the problem before he was willing to sit down with the feeling. When Ethan was little, things between us were easier because children usually understand love through whatever language the adults around them know how to use best. I took him to basketball practice, stood with him in the driveway shooting hoops until it got dark, helped him build a solar system model out of painted foam balls, sat by his bed when he had a fever, and changed the cold washcloth on his forehead like it was a thing so obvious nobody needed to praise it. I worked as a systems maintenance engineer for a packaged foods plant outside Dayton, and later moved into a small management role. And the job was steady enough except during those stretches when machinery went down or a line stalled, and the entire life of the household felt as if someone else were holding the control. I still thought I was a responsible father. I paid for things on time, showed up for the big events, remembered dentist appointments, reminded him to wear his helmet, drove him to math tutoring when Laura was busy. Laura used to joke, half affectionate and half accusing, that I loved the same two things, my son and the feeling of things running the way they were supposed to. Back then, I could still laugh at that. I did not understand that it was an early warning about the kind of man I was. Laura was softer than I was when it came to feelings, better at sitting down and listening to Ethan tell his winding stories without getting impatient for an exit. I was better with things that had shape, structure, something you could hold in your hands. Homework, a broken bike, worn-out basketball shoes, but those floating things like shame at school, the feeling of not belonging anywhere, fear of being laughed at, the kind of dread that has no obvious reason, I usually answered with the sentences I thought were useful. Don't overthink it. Focus on what you can control. If there's a problem, we deal with it one thing at a time. I had no idea how many times Ethan walked right up to the edge of saying something deeper, and then turned back because he realized his father could only hear him up to a certain point before everything started becoming a problem to be solved. There was one afternoon when he was 13, sitting on the edge of the kitchen table while I was checking work emails, when he asked offhandedly if I ever felt like I was standing in a room and still nobody could really see me. I can still remember looking up, assuming it was some middle school friend issue, then telling him everybody feels like that sometimes. The best thing to do is not wait for people to understand you too much. Just do your part well, and things will settle down. Ethan nodded, that quick nod children use when they do not want to make an adult more uncomfortable, then went upstairs. At the time, I turned back to the screen, without knowing I had just missed one of those small doors. Years later, sitting alone in my car outside his apartment, blocked on everything, I remembered that moment more clearly than 100 things I once thought mattered more. And I began to understand that a relationship does not break only because of the major things we do wrong. It also breaks because of those small doors, repeated often enough that nobody ever goes back to open. My marriage to Laura did not die in a storm. It died in something sadder, wearing away inside silence. We did not have an affair blowing up in the open. No plate throwing, no nights the neighbors could hear screaming through the walls. We simply became two people living in the same house, who always spoke as if we were changing shift, who was picking Ethan up, who was buying groceries at Kroger, who remembered to pay the electric bill, who was going to parent-teacher night next week. I came home later and later, not completely because of work, but because work was easier to stay inside than the house, where every exhaustion had started taking the shape of a quiet accusation. Laura was not cruel. She just kept touching the one part of me that was weakest, the feeling that no matter how hard I tried, I would never be soft enough, right enough, present enough in the ways people wanted from me. I know now that I retreated inward. I know that a lot of nights Ethan was doing homework in the living room, while I went straight down to the basement to watch baseball or pretend to fix a shelf that had been steady for months. just because it was quieter down there than in the kitchen. Men my age were taught to be very good at calling retreat, keeping calm. Most of the time, it was only cowardice in a quieter form. When Laura first brought up divorce, I was not as shocked as I should have been. What I remember most is the coldness of it, not the decision itself, but the way it was spoken like a truth that had died long before, and now had finally reached the date for paperwork. Ethan was 9 then, sitting on the staircase overhearing enough to understand that the house was no longer a whole, even though no one had used those words in front of him yet. We sat him down one Sunday night, and Laura said his parents were going to live in 2 different houses, but would still both love him. I told him his school schedule and sports schedule would not change too much. The first thing Ethan asked was not where he would live. He asked me, in a voice so small it felt like if he said it any louder it would become too true, "Why didn't you fight harder for us?" I remember sitting there in silence for several seconds. Laura turned to look at me. I told him that sometimes grown-ups are not good for each other anymore, even if they stay under one roof. I said it with all the calm I still believed was the kindest thing I could possibly offer. But something in his face just slipped away, as if my answer had confirmed exactly what he was afraid of. Later, I understood that for a child, adults not screaming does not mean he does not feel abandoned. Sometimes the fact that one person leaves too neatly is exactly what convinces the child that neither he nor the home they built together was ever worth fighting for with everything you had. After the divorce, Ethan stayed with Laura more often simply because his school was closer to her place, and I moved into a smaller townhome in Beaver Creek. Enough room for weekends together, but none of that feeling that this was where our family had grown up as one. At first I thought everything would settle. Every adult tells himself that sentence when he is too tired to survive any other truth. I still picked him up, still showed up to games, still took him out for burgers after practice, still fixed his old computer when he complained it was too slow, still did all the things that in my mind counted as keeping things stable. But what I never calculated was everything Ethan was seeing that I was not. The times he stood at the top of the stairs and heard Laura crying in the bathroom. The times he heard his grandmother say under her breath that your father always put work first. The times he waited for me to pick him up on a Friday night, and I got stuck at the plant because a conveyor line went down, and all I texted was, "Dad'll be a little late," as if 15 minutes and 45 minutes inside the mind of a child who had already lost his whole house were the same thing. Some of the changes were very small at first. Ethan told fewer stories about school, spent less time in the garage. When I asked how his day went, he said fine too fast. When I suggested we go fishing at Buck Creek, he said he had to study. When I showed up to one of his fall games, he waved once and never looked for my face again after halftime. I thought exactly what most fathers like me would have thought. Teenager stuff. Normals. Nobody wants their dad hovering at that age. I even felt wise for knowing how to step back. Give him room. Don't push. Even now, I do not know how much of that was respect, and how much of it was an elegant way to justify the fact that I did not know what to do once my son stopped being as readable as a machine with a manual. The first real hurt came when Ethan started texting me and calling me Michael, not in some fit of rage, not in some sarcastic, weaponized way, just dryly, "Michael, I'm staying at Mom's tonight. Michael, I already paid for the trip." I remember looking at my own name on the screen and at first almost laughing to myself, thinking maybe he was teasing me. But any joke repeated enough times becomes a structure, and I failed to call that thing by its name, while it was still small enough to face. Everything that happened after that, if I am honest enough to make even myself uncomfortable, can be traced back to one night that, at the time, I considered completely ordinary. I will come back to that night in a moment, because it took me years to understand that it was the real breaking point. But before I get there is something that has to be said plainly. A father and son do not collapse because of one evening alone. That kind of collapse has to be prepared by layers of silence beforehand, and I had prepared it too well. There was an important school event during Ethan's junior year, an awards ceremony tied to scholarship announcements, where he was being recognized for a summer engineering program. I had promised I would be there. I had even written down the time in the small notebook I kept in my coat pocket. But that afternoon, the main cooling line at the plant threw an alert and my crew was short-staffed. I called Ethan once and got no answer. I texted that I would get there as fast as I could. By the time I made it into the auditorium, the stage lights had already dimmed and people were folding chairs. Ethan was standing outside with his certificate rolled in his hand, Laura a few steps away. He was not crying. He was not angry. He did not do anything that would have made a man like me understand how big the moment really was and reprioritize it inside his mind. He just said, "It's okay," in a voice that sounded too adult. Then when I told him it could not be helped, I put a hand on his shoulder and said a sentence that now makes me want to hit myself every time I remember it. I told him, "You have to learn that life doesn't always stay on schedule for you." To me then, it sounded like a father teaching his son the kind of thickness he would need to survive the world. To Ethan, as I would only understand years later, that was the moment his father arrived after everything was already over, and then turned his hurt into a lesson. That evening, he had called me twice before the ceremony, once while he was getting dressed, once right before he walked into the auditorium. I did not hear either call because I was down on the floor, my phone vibrating in the pocket of the coat, hanging on a chair, while machinery and voices drowned it out. That was not the night that ruined everything. But to Ethan, maybe it was one of the last times he reached for me with his bare hands, before he stopped believing the distance between us could be crossed by his effort. After that fall, the silence was no longer just a pause between us. It became an environment of its own, that we both lived inside while calling it different things. Ethan went off to college in Columbus. I drove up to help him move into his freshman dorm, carried book boxes up 3 flights of stairs, tightened the right bed frame so it would not wobble, set up his monitor stand, then stood awkwardly by the window looking at the bright August campus and all those 18-year-olds pretending they were not afraid. I remember wanting to say a great many things, and being able to manage only one stupid sentence. "If you need money or anything, text me." Ethan nodded and said, "I know." He did not hug me for very long. It was not complete distance either. It was just that between us there was some thin pane of glass we could both see, and neither of us had enough courage to touch. Then came the months of clipped texts, the calls I missed and returned, and nobody picked up. The weekends I sent "Dad's near campus, want lunch," and got back only busy. At first I clung to the gentlest explanation. College is busy, new friends, new freedom. Then slowly, as the silence stopped looking like busyness and started looking like avoidance, I switched to another form of self-defense, uglier than the first. I began telling the story in my head, in whatever way hurt my pride least. Maybe he was ungrateful. Maybe Laura had spoiled him too much. Maybe kids that age are just like that now. Adults are very good at rewriting their own stories, just enough to survive what they cannot bear if they call it by its real name. I was no exception, but on the rare nights when that defense thinned out, especially after a few bourbons alone in my dark kitchen, the real question came back in its original shape, hard and foolish enough that no masculine language could make it less humiliating. What did I do? Then one early spring evening, after I tried calling Ethan 3 times in a row with no answer, Laura texted telling me not to call again that night. I called her back immediately, partly angry, mostly afraid. Laura was silent for several seconds, then said the first sentence that made the ground under me shift completely. "You really don't know, do you?" I asked her what I was supposed to know. She let out one long breath, the kind that belongs to someone who has carried a judgment too long and grown tired even of the weight of being right. "He thinks you chose work over family, not just in the divorce, long before that, and he thinks that night you chose not to come." I stood in my kitchen with one hand on the counter, staring at the yellow light above the sink and feeling as if someone had shoved something cold behind my breastbone. "What night?" Laura stayed quiet so long before answering that I knew, even then, whatever came next was going to be worse than almost anything I had imagined. "You really don't remember?" Then she said, very softly, almost not even accusing anymore. "That's the worst part. We met the next night at the old diner on Route 48, because Laura did not want to talk about it on the phone. I got there early, sat in the booth by the window watching rain mist across the parking lot, and tried to dig through every memory I had to find one night that could be important enough for Ethan to build years of anger around it, while I had never even named. Laura arrived in a navy coat that looked much older than it had in the years we lived together. She did not look at me with hatred. That made me more tired than hatred would have. We ordered coffee and did not drink it right away. Laura said Ethan did not just think I had put work first. He thought I had known he needed me most on one particular night, and still had not come. I told her I did not understand. She nodded like she had expected that. Then little by little, in the voice of someone who no longer wanted to win any argument, she told me the version Ethan had been carrying for years. That night was late in his junior year. He had been going through a terrible few months at school that, At the time, I had mostly read as teenage irritability. A group of boys around the volleyball team had been mocking him after a private text got passed around. Something that mixed humiliation and betrayal and public shame in a way 17-year-old boys drown in much faster than adults think. That evening there had been some kind of gathering after a game. Then something happened. Maybe somebody said more, maybe the girl he liked laughed, and Ethan walked out, sat alone in the lot behind the gym, panicking so badly he did not know who else to call. He called me first, not Laura. I asked why he had called me. Laura looked at me as if the question itself was the answer to half the story. Because when he is really scared, you are still the person he thinks of first. I had to turn and look out at the rain then because it felt as if something had slipped loose in my chest. Laura said Ethan called me several times, left a voicemail, waited in a friend's car, and finally called her. When she got there, he was folded in on himself in the passenger seat. Not crying, not talking, just cold. Like he had left some part of his body back out on that dark patch of pavement behind the gym. He told her he had called me. Nobody picked up. Laura, already full of all the unresolved anger she had carried from a marriage that had just collapsed. And from every moment she had felt me standing just outside some emotional thing because of work, or because I did not know how to step toward it. Said the thing she never should have said in front of a child who was already shattered. She told him, "Your father always thinks something else is more important." When she got to that part of the story, Laura stopped, both hands around her cooled coffee cup, and said very quietly that she had not planned to poison our son against me. She had just spoken one sentence out of her own pain. But children, especially children trying to find some access to understand their humiliation and fear in the dark, will cling to whatever sentence sounds most complete. From that night on, Ethan began building the rest of the story himself. And every time I was absent, every time I was late, every time I answered him with practicality instead of warmth, that story got another piece of proof. I sat there listening to all of it with no room in my head left to argue. Not because I agreed with every interpretation Laura or Ethan had made, but because underneath it was one terrible truth I could not outrun. The most important night in my son's life had somehow become one ordinary night in mine. I drove home after that dinner, numb more than hurting. Maybe the body knows that if it hurts right away, you will not make it home through rain and red tail lights on the highway. I walked into the house, took off my coat, and went straight down to the basement where several boxes of old things from the move after the divorce were still lined up against the wall like a graveyard for objects nobody had ever had the courage to sort through. There was a box of old phones, charging cables from earlier years, a hard drive, the point-and-shoot camera Ethan used at summer camp. All the things I had always meant to organize and then left untouched as if by not touching them, I could keep the past suspended where it was. I switched on every basement light, knelt on the cold concrete floor, and started digging through it all like a man clawing through the rubble of his own life. It took me nearly an hour to find the old iPhone I used in the years before the divorce. The screen cracked in one corner, still wearing one of those Cleveland Cavaliers stickers Ethan used to love. I plugged it in and waited for the Apple logo to come up, slow as a reluctant memory. The phone powered on. Not everything was still there, but enough. I sat on the basement steps with my back against the railing, my hands shaking for the first time that night, and opened the old voicemail archive I had completely forgotten existed. A long list appeared: unknown numbers, work messages, appointment reminders, a few messages from Laura from back when we still spoke like two people who had not yet become courteous strangers. And then I saw the date. November 11:17 p.m. The name on the screen was simply Ethan. My heart started pounding so hard, I had to stop for a few seconds before I could press play. When his voice came through the speaker, the whole basement seemed to shrink. He was not crying out loud. That made it worse. His voice was trying so hard to stay low, to stay even, the way young people do when they are standing on the edge of panic, and think that if they sound too fast or too afraid, whatever terrible thing is happening will become even more real. Dad, I don't know what to do. There was wind in the background, maybe traffic far away. He went silent for a couple of beats, as if swallowing something. I really need you right now. Then another silence. If you hear this, call me. Please. It was not long, not dramatic. Nothing in it accused me. That was exactly why it went through me like something thinner than every accusation I had ever heard. I sat perfectly still after the voicemail ended, unable to breathe properly for the first few seconds. Then I played it again and again, every time his voice came through. The part of my mind that had spent years telling a gentler story about myself broke open a little further. I had never heard that voicemail. I knew that as clearly as I know my own name. Back then, I had been switching phones. My voicemail box had been close to full, and there had been a stretch when the carrier botched message forwarding constantly. I remembered being annoyed about losing a few work voicemail. I did not remember anything from Ethan because, in the timeline I lived inside, nothing about that night had ever been large enough to mark itself as different from any other. And that, more than almost anything else, was what could not be forgiven easily, not even by me. It was not that I had deliberately abandoned my son. It was that I had been living in such a way that a night like that still did not stand out in my memory, until it was already far too late. I sat in that basement until my legs went numb, and the clock drifted close to 3 in the morning. In front of me, I did not just have proof that I was innocent in one narrow sense. I had proof of the gap my own silence, my clumsiness, and my habit of loving through action without language had left open long enough for misunderstanding to root itself in. The years after that night suddenly arranged themselves in a way that made me see everything more clearly and hate it more deeply. Ethan did not hate me because of one missed night alone. He hated me, or maybe more truthfully, he protected himself by turning me into someone he could not trust. Because after that night, I never did enough to interrupt the story he had begun building. I did not know that part was true, but I had also failed to look carefully enough to notice that his wound had changed shape. I remembered how he stopped asking me to look at his car, how he sat through dinner with his eyes always somewhere beyond the window, how every time I asked if he was okay, he answered, "Yeah," in that way that severed any deeper branch of conversation. I had called it being a teenager. Space, the sort of thing fathers and sons should not force. By then I could also remember how, after several months of not hearing from him at all, I myself had started protecting my pride with sentences like maybe he's ungrateful. Maybe Laura bobbied him too much. Maybe kids these days don't understand how much their parents sacrifice. None of those sentences ever made the hurt any smaller. They only helped me avoid staring directly at the possibility that part of this story had broken not because anyone was evil, but because I had spent a lifetime getting very good at living beside the silent zones of the people I loved, without learning the language for stepping inside. I called Ethan again the next morning. Nothing. I texted that I needed to see him. No answer. I sent one email, very short, without defending myself, just saying I had heard the old voicemail and I knew I owed him a conversation. The email did not trigger a blocked notification, but there was no sign it had been opened either. I drove up to Columbus that weekend, the old phone in my coat pocket like a piece of evidence that might save me or finish me off. I knew I could not repair years with one conversation in a parking lot, but there are times in life when the only thing left to do is stand in front of the other person long enough for them to see that you are finally not running anymore. Ethan came out of the apartment complex sometime close to noon, a backpack over one shoulder, one earbud still hanging loose, his hair a little longer than when he lived at home, his face leaner and harder. He saw me immediately, stopped for half a beat, then turned away with the reflex of someone confronted by an old injury. I said his name, not loudly. He did not turn back until I said, "Dad heard the message." His whole body seemed to jolt along some invisible wire. He turned back, his eyes suddenly cold. "What?" I said it again. "The voicemail. That night, I heard it." Ethan looked at me for a long time with the look of someone who has lived inside one truth for so many years. He no longer knows whether to hate you or fear you when you touch it. "You weren't there," he said. His voice was not raised. That was what made it hurt more. "Not when I needed you." I answered with the only true thing I had. "I didn't know." Ethan gave a short, empty laugh. "That's the point." He turned and took a few steps away as if to prove he still had the right to leave. I followed at a distance that did not feel like pursuit. "I never heard that voicemail back then." Ethan spun around. "Do you hear yourself? Do you know how that sounds?" I nodded. "Yes, it sounds awful, and I understand why that doesn't save anything for you." He stood there in the November wind, his jacket collar lifting around his neck. "I sat in that car for almost 40 minutes, he said, and for the first time his voice cracked in one place. "I kept thinking if I just wait, you'll call. If I just wait, you'll come. Mom came. You didn't." Each word landed in me like small stones thrown with perfect rhythm. I told him I knew. He shook his head immediately. "No, you don't, because if you did, you wouldn't have spent years acting confused." I pulled the old phone out of my coat pocket. I did not shove it toward him. I just held it there between us like something heavy. I don't want you to believe me just because I'm saying it. But I have it. Ethan looked at the phone, then at me, then said very quietly, "Too late." I told him, yes, too late for a lot of things, but not too late for you to know that I didn't deliberately leave you there. Maybe it was because I was not pleading. Maybe because I did not try to hug him or grab hold of him the way drowning people grab anything. Whatever the reason, Ethan did not walk away. He stood there, farther than an arm's length from me, but still standing. And at our age, at that degree of rupture, simply not leaving right away was already a decision. We sat down at a small coffee shop a couple of blocks away, because the cold was getting worse, and a parking lot is no place to say aloud the kinds of things that have been rotting between two people for years. Ethan sat across from me, both hands around his cup as if holding on to body heat, his eyes looking away from me more often than at me. I played the voicemail for him. I did not watch his face while it played. I looked out the window at people passing with scarves and paper cups, because if I watched him head-on, I was afraid I would interfere with the way the truth needed to reach him on its own. When it ended, Ethan did not speak right away. He just swallowed, his fingers tightening around the cup until the knuckles turned white. "So what?" he finally said. "It didn't get to you. You still weren't there?" I nodded. "That's true. I still wasn't there, and I'm not pretending otherwise." He looked up then, maybe because he had not expected that sentence. I kept going, slowly, trying not to use any words that sounded like self-excuses. I told him that night I had been at the plant, my phone stowed away because of the floor policy in that section. And when I finally left, there was no voicemail alert, just one missed call I assumed was nothing because he had not called back again. I told him none of that made his pain smaller. None of it made that night less real. But it changed one very important thing. I had not been sitting somewhere watching his name on my screen and choosing not to come. Ethan listened, his face still very hard. "Then why didn't you know something was wrong after that?" That question was harder than all the accusations before it, because it struck right at the place I could not evade. I could explain the voicemail failure. I could not easily explain the silence of the years after it, except to say it was the fault line in my own character. Because I was stupid, I said, not beautifully, not carefully. Because I thought when people go quiet, the right thing is to give them room. Because I thought not forcing you to talk was respect. Because I was so used to handling things with shape that when you started saying less, I kept telling myself it was adolescence, a phase, something that would pass. Ethan laughed softly, but this time it was not entirely cruel. "It was just tired. Space," he said, as if testing the word and finding bitterness there. "That's what you call it. I called it being left alone." I sat silent for a long moment because right there, between those two names for the same behavior, was the whole tragedy of us. To me, space was what a father who did not want to suffocate his son was supposed to give. To him, space was a door closing one more time after it had already closed in that parking lot when he was 17. Nobody had intentionally destroyed this relationship in the way people like to imagine a single villain, so they can sleep at night. There was no obvious bad person. There were only two men, one older and one younger, speaking two emotional languages, with years of silence between them that had turned misunderstanding into character. "I should have come after you," I said. "At least once. Really come after you. Knock on the door. Sit outside in my car. Tell you that maybe I didn't understand everything, but I wasn't going anywhere." Ethan looked down at the table. "Why didn't you?" I answered with the ugliest truth, because by then I no longer had anything else useful left. Because I thought giving you space was the right thing. And because part of me was protecting myself too, telling myself that if you didn't want to talk, pushing harder would only make it worse. I didn't want to be rejected so many times that I had to look straight at the fact that I had lost you. Saying that out loud made me feel as if I had aged several years in that chair. For the first time, the room between father and son was no longer filled with advice, reasoning, or defense. There was only the truth. Ugly, late, but true. There was no moment in that coffee shop that looked like reconciliation. Ethan did not cry and reach across the table to hug me. I did not make some noble speech about men, family, or forgiveness. We just sat there a very long time. There were stretches of silence so long that the sound of the espresso grinder behind the counter felt as if it belonged to another world. Ethan started talking, not in a clean stream, but in pieces I had to stay still long enough to let settle where they want. About that night behind the gym, about the feeling of sitting in the darkness of the lot, cold sweat all over his back, the screen of his phone lighting up and going dark again while my name never called back. About how Laura came. But even then he kept looking out the car window because maybe, just maybe, I would still show up. About how the next morning all I sent was a short text asking if things were okay. And how he read that as proof that I wanted to skip over everything, not enter it. I did not cut him off. I did not correct a single sentence. There were places I wanted to say. That was not what I had been thinking back then. But by then, I understood that was the old trap. What mattered was not what I had privately meant at every point. What mattered was what my actions had taught my son to believe. When Ethan finished, he sat there looking at the empty bottom of his cup. I asked if there had ever been times after that when he had wanted to tell me. He gave a thin, tired smile. Plenty of times. Then you'd call and ask practical questions, or give advice, or act like all we needed was more time. Each word drove another old scene back into place. It dawned on me then that Ethan had not stopped opening the door after that night. He had opened it many times. He just had not opened it loudly, or obviously enough for a man like me to recognize it. And I, all those years, had stood outside the door, seeing it cracked 1 inch, and telling myself maybe he just was not ready yet. That is the kind of mistake only people who like to think of themselves as responsible make. We use our calmness and restraint as proof of our virtue. And then we never notice that we are abandoning other people in a more polite form. After that meeting, Ethan did not unblock me that same day. He did not start calling me Dad again. He did not promise me anything. Before he stood up, he asked, in a voice that had lost some of its sharpness but was tired enough to sound much older, "So what now?" I told him the only thing that was not false. "I don't know. I don't think we fix years in one afternoon. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know anymore." Ethan nodded very slightly. Not with happiness, not with forgiveness, just as though he had heard enough. For now, not to leave with the door slamming shut one more time. 2 weeks later, he texted me first. Not something long, just a question about an old car he was thinking of buying, along with a photo of the engine. What made me set the phone down and only pick it up again after a full minute was not the question itself. It was the fact that he had texted at all. He did not call me Michael. He did not call me Dad. He simply reached. I answered more slowly than I wanted to, because all my life I had been too quick to use advice in place of closeness. And now I had to learn again how not to let a technical answer swallow the human part. I told him the engine looked okay if he wanted me to listen to it run in person, then added that if he wanted, I could drive up that weekend and look at it with him. Ethan did not answer right away. He texted that evening, "Okay, just that," but I read it over and over like a man who has gone hungry for years being handed a meal too small to call enough, and still feeling his whole body remember warmth. The months after that were not beautiful. I wish I could say we had one conversation. Everything came out, and from there things naturally began flowing back into place. Real life does not work that way, especially with distances that have been fed by years. There were awkward coffees. There were times Ethan canceled at the last minute, and the wounded child inside me still raised its head and wanted to interpret that as punishment. There were drives back to Dayton after a meeting that only lasted 40 minutes and still left me more exhausted than a night shift. There were times Ethan asked questions that sounded curious on the surface, but were really him poking at the old fracture to see if it still hurt. Did you ever think about getting back together with Mom? Were you actually happy at home back then? Did you ever think I was a burden? The man I used to be would have answered those questions fast, clearly, and in terms of right and wrong. By then, I was learning how to sit with them longer. I started therapy, which, if somebody had suggested it to me at 40, I probably would have frowned and thought it was for people who liked listening to themselves talk about feeling. It turned out some people only become humble enough to learn the basic language of their own heart after they have already damaged the thing that mattered most. Laura had a small part in the repair too, not as the villain under judgment, but as another adult who had to look directly at her own mistake. She apologized to Ethan for that sentence in the car. She apologized to me for allowing her pain to become a sentence too easy for a child to cling to. I did not forgive her in any grand way. I just understood that we had both been adults far too tired and far too limited at the very moment. We needed to be the best parents we knew how to be. Nobody wins in that. There is only a child who grows up carrying the wrong map of his father, and a father who has to live with the fact that that map was not drawn entirely by anyone else. What surprised me most, or maybe scared me most, was how the shift in Ethan over those first months of speaking again showed up most clearly in the smallest places. He stopped calling me Michael, but did not return to Dad right away either. He began texting me ridiculous engineering memes, which was the kind of thing he used to do as a kid when he wanted to tease me. He asked my opinion about changing internships. He started telling me half-finished stories about school, and then trailing off, like a person testing whether the ice beneath him was strong enough to take another step. I changed in small places too. I stopped answering immediately with solutions, stopped filling silence with instructions. There was a time he told me, almost irritated, that he hated feeling as if he always had to look like he had his life under control in front of his friends. I was about to say that everybody feels that way at that age, then managed to stop myself. I just asked, when did that start feeling true for you? Ethan looked up at me as if the question itself were an event. Men like me never understand how much hearing without fixing can feel like a door opening to the other person, until they actually see that look. One early autumn morning, I drove up to Columbus, and Ethan was bent over the old Subaru he bought a few months earlier. We lifted the hood, cold air mixing with the smell of motor oil, the wind cutting through the back lot of his building. He held out his hand without looking at me and said, "Can you hand me the 10mm?" No, father. No, Michael. Just can you? One simple word. But I stood there with the wrench in my hand and understood that this is how real life sometimes returns to you what you lost. Not through a grand scene, through an act so small no outsider would notice anything at all, while the people inside it know that an entire distance has just been crossed by one more inch. We did not talk about the voicemail that day. We did not talk about the divorce. We did not talk about fault. We just worked on the car, wiped our hands with greasy paper towels, drove out to a diner near the highway, ordered eggs, bacon, and black coffee. Ethan told me about a professor who was impossible to please. I told him some story from the old plant about an intern who almost burned out a motor because he forgot to check the load. There were still silences, but they no longer felt like pits that had to be filled in a hurry. They were simply spaces between two people trying to learn a language they had neglected too long. I do not want to lie to anyone and call this a beautiful ending. It is not beautiful in the way that lets you walk away from a story feeling soothed. Ethan did not become the little boy who used to sit in the garage with me again. I did not become the kind of father who knows how to say everything at the right time just because of a few months of therapy and a handful of awkward conversations. Some things were lost and stayed lost. Ethan at 17, those early college years, the nights he probably needed a father willing to walk straight through his silence, and instead got more space. The defenses he built in himself, so he could live with the story that his father had abandoned him on the worst night of his life. The defenses I built so I could live with having lost my son without knowing exactly why. Nobody gets time back here. All we had was the truth, belated, not clean, not enough to save everything, but enough to stand on and stop building more life on a misunderstanding. Ethan set boundaries with me, and with Laura too, that he did not want to be turned into the container for our pain anymore. I respected that, not because I was noble, because I finally understood what it means to call something by its right name. He did not owe me a quick healing just because I had proof that I had not deliberately abandoned him, and I did not owe myself a prettier version of the story just so I could sleep better. The hardest part was not finding the voicemail. The hardest part was living with the fact that this tragedy did not come from malice, but from character, from silence, from the sorts of things in men like me that society rewards until they destroy something that cannot be measured by logic. Several months later, on Mother's Day weekend, Ethan stopped by Laura's place in the morning and came to my house in the afternoon to pick up an old folding chair he wanted to take camp. Before he left, he stood in the kitchen doorway with his car keys in his hand, looking around the house as if checking some old map he had abandoned halfway through. I had kept his old room almost exactly the same, not like a shrine, just because I never fully brought myself to touch it. There were still comic books, his old baseball glove, a band poster whose name I could no longer remember. Ethan asked if I had ever thought about clearing it all out. I told him I had many times, but I kept thinking that if he ever needed to come back for something, it would be easier if it was all still there. He stood there for a moment, then nodded, not with some big emotional reaction, not with an apology for all those cold years. But that night, while I was washing dishes, my phone lit up with a text from him. "Thanks for keeping everything," just that. I read the text in the quiet kitchen, listening to the faucet and the soft ticking of the wall clock. then stood with both hands braced on the edge of the sink long enough for the water to run over my fingers and go cold. Maybe that was the closest thing to healing people like us ever get. Not returning to where it was before, just having somebody finally see that you never completely erased the place where they belonged, even when you yourself once failed to stand in it the way you should have. Now, if somebody asks me why my son once stopped talking to me, I would never say it was just a misunderstanding, because the word just makes the whole thing sound smaller than it was. I would not say it was because of his mother either, because Laura had a part in it, but she is not the whole story. I would say it happened because one night that was enormous in his life was ordinary in mine, and because after that night, both of us did what we thought was survival. He built a story so his pain would have shape. I built a story so I would not have to look directly at the gap opening between us. Laura added to it with her own bitterness. Time locked it all into place, and the thing that leaves you most exhausted about this kind of loss is that there is no single person to hate and be done with. There are only too many small moments where, if one of us had acted a little differently, maybe the map would not have taken that route. But life never lets you go back and edit each moment. It only gives you the late chance to stop living inside the wrong story. Ethan did not come back to who he was before everything broke. Maybe I did not either. He is still cautious in certain places. My heart still tightens one extra beat whenever I see his name light up my phone. We still have conversations that stall halfway through, because we both step into ground neither of us knows how to cross yet. But there is one difference I no longer dare take lightly. He does not leave the moment the truth becomes difficult. He does not walk away into silence the way he used to. And one Sunday morning, while we were out in the driveway changing the rear brake pads on that old Subaru, thin sunlight across the neighbors' roofs and the radio in the garage playing some country song too softly to place, Ethan handed me a screwdriver and said, without thinking hard enough to stop himself, "Dad, this part's loose here." I looked up. He realized what he had just said at the same time I did, but he did not take it back. We did not look at each other for long. Just one beat, then we both turned back to the car. Some words return not like declaration. They return like wild animals, finally stepping out from the edge of the woods. And maybe that is where this story really ends. Not with everything repaired, but with there still being distance between us, with years we can never get back, with a weight neither of us is honest enough to call gone. Yet for the first time in a very long time, my son did not turn and leave when the truth stood between us. He stayed, and for people who once lost each other inside silence, sometimes staying is the closest thing to a miracle life is willing to give.